Okay, this is my third time trying to do this dang video. Um, okay, so, uh, alright. So, move this back up there so that I can. One second. Move faster! Ah. Okay. So I watched Schindler's List for the first time in my life today, which is kind of crazy because it's May 15th, 2015, and it was made in like the early 90s, so it's almost as old as I am. I was made in 90. Oh. Anyway, so, so Schindler's List, of course, is about a man who was a businessman who he joined the Nazi Party so that he could actually get sales, right? So anyway, because he was a businessman and he saw that that would be the best way to get sales, would be to join the party that all the wealthy people were in and everything like that. They had all the power and the money and all that crap. Of course, he did not agree with what they did. It's kind of a weird thing, but he joined it not knowing what they were going to do. And then they did what they did, and he saw it, and he, he started to go against that. But kind of secretly, so that he wouldn't get killed and so that he wouldn't get his business taken away, which was the only way that he was able to save these people. And so I saw an extra that was on the DVD that it had some of the Schindler Jews, what they call them, who were there, and who had gone through this, and they were talking about Oskar Schindler, and apparently he was the kind of man who would always be upbeat, and he'd be the center of the room, and he was apparently always talking, always happy. He would always be drinking something like wine or something like that, but he would never be drunk. He knew his limits, so he just kind of drank lightly, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, so then so I put together this kind of like little list of kind of my highlights from the extras. So there was a woman who worked kind of slave labor type of work. They made them basically slaves. They put them in these the ones that were there, they had put them into a 16 block walled kind of village, I guess you could say, or something like that. It was a camp. They called it a ghetto, the Jewish ghetto, or something like that. Anyway, so he got workers from this place, and there was a woman who worked in the house of the person who owned, or not owned, who was in charge of the place, and her name was Helena Jonas Rosenzweig. I don't know, you could correct me if you could find that name, but anyway, of course, she was a Jew, but anyway, one time he apparently took her, and he would always say great things to her and positive things, like this wouldn't last and all that stuff. And one time he took her to a window, and they looked out, and they were looking at all the workers, and he said, you remember the Jews in Egypt were slaves and then they were freed? This is what's going to happen to you. One day you're going to be all free from this hell. You will see. That's what he said to her, and it made her feel, a lot better, even though she didn't know if he would, if he's right. Gosh, holding this phone is like tiring, even though it's not really that heavy. But anyway, one sec. Okay, had to make sure of something. So, and then this one woman was saying that a foreman, because he had started this company up there, and he employed Jews, and he fed them, and he gave them clothing. He did all sorts of stuff for them. And anyway, one day a foreman took this girl from the station where she was working and told her to operate the lathe. And the lathe broke, and the foreman accused her of sabotage, which was punishable by death at the time. And someone got Schindler, and he said, "What is this?" He said it in German, of course, but anyway, "What is this? What is this?" And the foreman told him she broke the machine. So she said that he walked around and he walked around the station, the workstation, and looked at her and looked at the foreman, and he said, "This little girl broke this machine?" He's like, "You moron. She couldn't possibly break this machine." He patted her on the head, or on her head, and asked, "Where were you working before?" She pointed to the machine that she was working at before, and he turned to the foreman and said, "That's where she works. That's where she's gonna stay." It's like, that's just hilarious. This is a Jewish girl who the Nazis, didn't even consider them to be really even humans. They called them names like subhuman and just, a bunch of crazy names. So then the Germans were about to, and this was in Poland, that he had this factory in, and the Germans were liquidating all the factories there, and they were going to close down the ghetto and send all the Jews to Auschwitz, which was one of the worst places you could ever go to if you were a Jew at the time. I mean, there are so many stories I've heard of Auschwitz, and just myself, and it's kind of funny because I've got quite a bit of German blood in me, but heck, my last name is Goehring, well, Enriquez-Goehring, but it's just, it's pretty crazy stuff. Anyway, so what he did was so amazing. it just baffles me. I mean, this guy risked everything to do this. He he had to bribe a bunch of people. He had to, pay for these people, and he made a list of about 1,200 Jewish people. And it says on the movie it says over 1,100, but on his grave, which by the way is in Israel, at the Catholic Church there on Mount Zion. That's where he's actually buried. It said 1,200 Jews. And he got families out. He got whole families out. He got. There was this one woman. That woman Helena. And I won't say her last name because I'll probably definitely destroyed it last time by accident. Anyway, he asked her if she had family, and she said, yeah, 2 sisters, and he said, quick, what are their names? And he put their names on the list. I mean, he got people's families out, and so he made this list of about 1,200 people, Jewish people, from occupied Poland, and he called them expert workers. And it's for his new factory that he was going to open up in Brindlitz, Czechoslovakia. So these people were on the list, and the men and boys who were on the list, they separated them and they put them into boxcars, caged boxcars, like animals, These, even though they were on his list and they were going to be basically freed. For 1 sec. So, okay, checking that again. I keep hitting it, but I don't know if I hit it because it just makes this little click, and it doesn't really sound. So anyway, so they were put in these boxcars, and the men and boys who were on the list left safely a week before the women did, and they got there safely, and to Brindlitz, which by the way was occupied by the Nazis, the Germans, or the Nazis. Anyway, and but he worked around that, and so anyway, the men and boys arrived there, and they were given soup and bread and food, and just clothes and all sorts of stuff, and then the women left, and the women and girls left, and they somehow, there was like a problem with apparently there was a problem with the paperwork or something like that, and they somehow ended up in Auschwitz. And and this was kind of described by that. This was described by a couple of women. One woman said the sky was red with like the smoke and everything, and the sun. Another said they could smell burning flesh, and there was ashes and smoke all around. They were taken to bathhouse to quote unquote a bathhouse, and told to strip down, and they were told to throw all their clothes and possessions on them onto the ground in a pile, and to step into the building. And they were shaved everywhere, shaved down everywhere, and they were, put inside of the place, and it had, you know, shower heads, but it was not uncommon for gas to come out of those shower heads. So they didn't know if they were going to get gassed or actually get a shower. So it could have gone either way, and so, but it turned out that it was water that time. So they survived, and then they were stuck there for 3 weeks. Some of them did not believe that Schindler was going to be able to rescue them this time. But he sent a quote-unquote beautiful German woman with expensive gifts to the commander, the SS commander in charge of Auschwitz, which is pretty ballsy. Just gonna say that word, But anyway, it was like 3 days later or something like that. And she had gifts, expensive gifts and all that. And about 3 days later, the women were on their way. The women and girls who were on the list were on their way to they were on their way to Brinlitz. Yeah. So, and then, the women finally arrived safely after weeks of being stuck there, and they were offered bread and, and soup and food, and water and everything. By the way, there was never a single thing that came out of that factory. They did not actually do anything in that factory. They made it look like they were working so that they could get away with it. But not a single thing came out of that factory ever. And it's pretty amazing, really. He bribed everybody, and he made it look like they were doing that. Oh, had to make sure that I didn't hit that twice. So anyway, when the war was over, he gave each person cloth for capital to start their new lives with, and they could make something for themselves, or they could sell it or barter it, or they could make something to sell, something like that. There are more than 6,000 descendants of the Schindler Jews today. Well, in the 90s, so probably even more today, I mean, there were more then, so definitely that's true. It holds true. So he saved 1,200 people, but, there are more than 6,000 of them, descendants of them, and that's pretty amazing that he was able to do that and save so many people. When the war ended, he left. He was technically a Nazi, so he had to turn himself in or run. So he turned himself into the Americans, us, by the way, and every single one of his workers signed an affidavit that stated that that's 1,200 signatures that stated that he had saved them. and he was released. He went to Argentina and, try. He never became wealthy again. I mean, he lost everything after the war, and he never became wealthy again. And then he just, but I guess he only had that just so that he could do that specific thing, to save hundreds of people's lives. And that's pretty amazing, really. Even if he couldn't get more out, 1,200 people. There was more than 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazi regime in World War II. I mean, during that time, 6 million in 6 years, about. That's pretty crazy to think about. 6 million people just murdered. And that's just the Jews alone. Then there were people who helped them who were killed, and all sorts of craziness. There were Americans who were killed. There were, and I mean Americans who didn't fight in the war. They were on a cruise liner. There was one cruise liner that was shot down because it was in quote unquote German water territories. It really wasn't. It was on international waters, but the Germans had claimed it, even though it wasn't accepted by everybody. And so they. Anyway, yeah, I know this video kind of ran long, and it's I guess not really the greatest, but I just thought that I would kind of say something about that, because it's pretty amazing to think about this guy who was he was, I mean, he would sleep around. He was a gambler. Well, he at least played cards. I don't know if he really gambled that much. I mean, he did a lot of, he was a Nazi. Even though he didn't agree with what they were doing, and he did something about it, just, he wasn't the perfect guy, of course. Who is a perfect person, I mean, I only know of one person who ever lived, but that's a topic that I won't get into because it'll cause a lot of, I don't want to get into any kind of crazy debates about beliefs or anything like that. But anyway, he was not a perfect person, but he did something extremely good in saving lives as much as he could, and that in itself is amazing. So anyway, be sure to like, subscribe, thumbs up, all that stuff, comment, and just be yourself. Thanks.